All right, get ready. This is the Baroque, one of the most interesting time periods that we'll cover in this semester. One of my personal favorite periods in architectural design and history. It's a period of a lot of free expression. We For the first time in the course of this semester, in the arc of the 500 years we've been studying thus far, where we're going to see a movement that disposes with the notion of the classical proportion and the classical orders, and is going to try to invent something completely different from what our predecessors, architects prior to this time period, have been doing. Part of what you're going to see, the work, the plans, the sections, the details, the facades, um, actually primarily the plan, is also going to be a response to what we've been studying for the past week. The Protestant Reformation is not something to be ignored. The church has been shaken. When I say the church, I'm referring to the Catholic Church, the real superpower of the world at this time period. They've taken note of the Protestant Reformation. To some degree, they feel as though things have gotten out of hand with the Catholic Church, and for our purposes, the architecture of papal Rome. So they're taking note and they're going to respond. And one of the responses is doing away with the idea of the central plan church. No more central plan churches, as Bernini, Borromini, da Cortona, and the Baroque masters are told. And so they have to invent. They have to invent a way to, and I will explain using some of the slides what is meant by that and how the architects, the genius architects of the Baroque, come up with the idea of developing a non-central plan church, as well as secular buildings. Palazzo Barberini will look at. Palazzo da Spada will look at. So it's not just the architecture, religious architecture, but also some of the domestic work being done as well. What's Baroque? Baroque in Portuguese means a flawed pearl. In art, or in fine art, it is considered to be anything that's bizarre, irregular, or departing from the ideals of the Renaissance, as I mentioned earlier, going away from the classical proportions, going away from the ideals of the Renaissance, is considered Baroque. So it's a divergence. It's a almost a rejection of anything from the past. So again, anything bizarre, irregular, or departing from the Renaissance ideals. The thing that I think has always drawn me to the work of the Baroque is, and this isn't my terminology necessarily, but terminology of professors who I have had in architecture school, and some of the other great architectural lecturers whose lectures I study and watch, and whose notes I read and whose slides I study. will often refer to the Baroque as a period in which there is a characteristically obvious sense of drama in the work. Theater is another common term that you'll see. Um, what what will be very obvious, and is obvious in the work of Borromini, as you're seeing here on this slide, is the architects become fascinated with the idea of the curve, and we're going to start to see the curve, both concave and convex. We're going to see ellipse. We're going to see oval. We're going to see curving facades, so we're going to see curves in 3 dimensions. The use of the non-orthogonal geometry really presents itself with a flair in the Baroque. And that's a common characteristic. We're going to start to see columns being thrust forward, kind of liberated from the facade, pushed forward and carrying, really acting as elements of articulation and no longer having a structural responsibility or a structural role in the facade. So really columns being used for decorative purposes, to put it simply. We're going to see swirls and decorations, a lot of playfulness. There's a lot of kind of breaking the rules and breaking tradition. And there's a little bit of, I'm going to just because I can, in the Baroque. And while that element itself is not something that maybe I appreciate as much as some others do or have, or maybe you do, it's there, and that's definitely a part of the work of the Baroque masters. Sculptures and placement of sculptures is really, it's more about the placement of sculptures. I'll point them out in some of the slides. We've been seeing sculpture in our architecture for the past 9-10 weeks. That's not a new thing. But the placement of sculpture, again, back to the point about drama, there's a sort of more careful curation of where sculpture is placed, and it's done a little bit more theatrically, brought forward a little bit more, made more prominent, and also the way light is used to highlight sculpture is different from what we've seen in the past. What's most common is we'll see sculpture kind of dotting a pediment or an entablature. Not a pediment, an entablature. Really, when it's on the interior, you might see a long nave with paired columns, a deep entablature, and then sculpture kind of dotting that. Not necessarily the primary focal point, or not at points of focus within the architecture, within the space. We're going to see that used as a technique a lot more in the Baroque. Okay, and the Baroque is, we're going to do a deep study of 3 or 4 projects from the 2 who I consider to be, and many architects, architectural historians, theoreticians, art historians consider to be really the 2 main characters of the Baroque period, and in part because of their work, but also in part because of this fantastically interesting rivalry that the 2 of them have. We're going to do a deep focus on the work of Francesco Borromini and Gian Lorenzo Bernini. So Borromini and Bernini, 2 names to remember. And I kind of split my lecture on the Baroque into 2 separate, probably 1-hour lectures, so that I can focus a little bit more on the masterworks of Borromini and Bernini, as well as a couple of the other early Baroque masters, or the Baroque, I would say, masters. And then the second lecture, which I'll post later this week, will get into the sort of late Baroque work, the more the way I think about it is the Baroque gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and it gets too heavy and it kind of collapses on itself, for lack of a better term. So, what we're looking at is this sort of early to middle period Baroque. I think when the Baroque sort of reaches its peak, its mastery. Um, but then it starts to get a little bit excessive. There's some beautiful work that we're going to look at in the second lecture this week. But the way I've always thought about it is, this is kind of the culmination is Borromini and Bernini, and then it kind of gets heavy and sort of caves in upon itself before we start to get into really modernism. Okay, the main characters of the Baroque. I'm going to go through the names and I'll kind of organize them in terms of lineage for a moment. There's definitely Francesco Borromini. Well, let me start with the first. Really, the sort of father of the Baroque is Pietro da Cortona. Rather, Carlo Maderno, the really the kind of the father of the Baroque. Carlo Maderno trains Francesco Borromini, who you're seeing on screen, and Gian Lorenzo Bernini, both of whom I will get into biographical details in a moment. Carlo Maderno is trained as a stonemason. He's born in Capolago, in Switzerland, and studies in Naples. Carlo Maderno lives 1556 to 1629. So really, when we're studying the Baroque, we're studying the very tail end of the 16th century and moving into the 17th century. So he lives 1556 to 1629, trains in Naples, and really becomes a craftsman and a builder first, really, and that leads him to becoming an architect. Maderno really trains both Bernini and Borromini as his pupils. So both of these great men of the Baroque train under Carlo Maderno. Let me give you the dates, the birth and death years of both Francesco Borromini, who is on screen, and Gian Lorenzo Bernini here. Francesco Borromini is born in Ticino in 1599, so at the very, very end of the 16th century, and lives to 1667. Gian Lorenzo Bernini, again, these two fierce rivals are born a year apart from one another. Gian Lorenzo Bernini is born 1598 and lives to 1680. Part of the reason why Borromini doesn't live as long as Bernini is Borromini, after a long and really tumultuous and very difficult, he himself is a difficult personality, as we'll study, but he commits suicide at 68 years old. The way the legend goes about Borromini is as he falls on his sword and takes his own life, simultaneous with that, he is burning his drawings in a fire because he doesn't want anybody ever to take credit for his work. Nonetheless, he's considered a master, and we'll see some of his work and you'll be able to evaluate for yourself. Before I get into more biographical information on Borromini and Bernini, let me give you the rest of the names. So Carlo Maderno, Bernini, Borromini, Pietro da Cortona, who was born in Cortona and lives in Tuscany, lives 1596 to 1669. And then moving into the kind of later Baroque characters, we have Carlo Fontana, 1638 to 1714, and Carlo Rainaldi, 1611 to 1691. Carlo Fontana is an interesting figure in that he works for Pietro da Cortona, he works for Gian Lorenzo Bernini, and he works for Carlo Rainaldi. So he really becomes trained by three different master Baroque architects. Okay, Francesco, and I'm gonna do vocabulary at the same time as I'm introducing some of the work. Francesco Borromini, 1599-1667. He dies in Rome. He is largely considered to be an autodidact or an erudite, essentially a self-taught scholar. At the time of his death, he has volumes of thousands of books, which clearly we see from his work and the sort of sketches that explain his work. Clearly, he was an intellectual and a deep thinker. But he wasn't necessarily trained formally in terms of his education, and he was sort of self-taught in terms of some of that higher knowledge that he achieved during his time period. He studied Michelangelo very carefully. He studied Michelangelo's works, and he, unlike Bernini, Borromini's father was a stonemason, and as a result, he himself studied as a stonemason. So he basically came into architecture the more traditional way, which is through the building craft. Whereas Bernini kind of came through the arts. Bernini, by the way, is just as well known. In fact, in some regards, is even better known for his magnificent sculpture. He was also a sculptor and a painter. Borromini kind of sort of straight line of path in architecture. He does study in Milan and then goes to Rome to work for Carlo Maderno. So this is Francesco Borromini. We'll get into San Carlo al Quattro Fontane, which is, I believe, his masterwork. This is the ceiling of Quattro Fontane, which we'll study in a moment. Let's move to Bernini. So Bernini, 1598 to 1680, born in Napoli. He's a sculptor. He's the son of a sculptor. By age 10, he's already identified as being a child prodigy, having deep skill and talent in the art of sculpture. And he quickly sort of counterpoint with Borromini. Bernini befriends and is really a part of the society, the circle in society of the papacy. His family are friends with the Borghese, ruling class, and Pope Paul V is a common source of work for Bernini. Actually, there's a quote from the book that describes Bernini's sculpture. I'll share it with you here. What Shakespeare is to drama, Bernini is to sculpture. So he's very highly regarded as a sculptor as well as an architect. The thing I admire most about Bernini's work is I describe it as the fold. Others describe it as the fold. And in fact, the first time this even caught my attention, Frank Gehry was talking about sort of understanding the difference in quality between a Bernini fold and a Michelangelo fold. And so I immediately, Google searched and started to look at what in the world that even means. And there's a distinct characteristic in Bernini's marble sculpture where again, this idea of drama, there's a sort of theatricality to the way he depicts the cloth and the folds in the cloth. I wouldn't describe it necessarily as realistic, but it's hard to deny that there's an incredibly theatrical value to the quality of the way he's kind of accentuating and treating the fabric, almost exaggerating the surface quality of the cloth um, as it's crumbled and laid upon and within the crevices of the body here. This is Ludovico Albertoni. He carves this sort of late in his life, 71 to 74, and again he dies in 1980. So this is kind of masterwork happening at the end of his career. Known for being charming, having political connections, which is why he has such a successful career. And maybe that's part of what drives Borromini to be the kind of personality that he is, the difficult, kind of more rough personality, because Bernini is seen as the sort of charming, the more affluent, more accepted within the social circles. But that's not to take away anything from the mastery of the architectural quality of Borromini. Story about this I'll share with you at the end here. Okay, what do we mean by no central plan? So the idea of nave transept having a clear kind of intersection, a central focal point in the church. This is kind of going back to the Protestant Reformation and the Roman Catholic Church's response to kind of admitting some flaws, but also wanting to sort of reinvent itself. So all of these architects are told expressly no central plan churches. So what some of the Baroque masters come up with is the idea of really an oval. If you break down an oval geometrically, an oval is a combination or a blending together of two circles. And so what that means is there are actually two central points. And when there are two central points, there's not one central point. So there's still the notion of centrality or implicit centrality, implied centrality, but that centrality is across a multitude of points rather than a singular point. So that's one way to sort of decentralize the church plan. The other is when you have an oval, it's more difficult to express a crossing, so a transept across an oval, and so what eventually ends up happening is the spatial quality of the interior starts to read as one rather than nave transept, where the transept may have a hierarchically secondary nature to some of the spaces off of the transept. You don't have that luxury because you're really dealing with a circular form now, and it's almost as though the space reads as one contiguous interior space. A couple of the vocabulary terms I want to start introducing, which I will complete the vocabulary terms and post them after I'm done with the second lecture. But one of the terms is superimposition. So what superimposition means is basically the overlaying of one thing on top of the other. In architecture, when we use the term superimposition, oftentimes we're referring to the idea of, this is a plan diagram that has simple mathematical geometry superimposed over it to help us better read what the plan is doing or what the architect's intent is. These nodes don't exist in the actual space. They're diagrammatically superimposed over the floor plan to help us better read the plan. When we say close reading, this is one of the techniques that we use to close read a work of architecture. This is Bernini's Quirinale, which we'll get into here in a moment. You get the idea of the no central plan notion and the circular form that the Baroque tends to be drawn towards. But also there's a kind of a rotation, whereas in the prior plan, one of the similarities between the Baroque elliptical church form and the traditional Renaissance church form is that there's still a notion of a long axis and a short axis. It's just the way the volume is wrapped, the long axes and the short axes are not defined by orthogonal lines. They're actually defined by the ellipse or the oval. What Bernini is doing here is he's basically rotating that 90 degrees, and he's even flipping that idea on its head and treating the short axes along the direction with which you enter, and the long axes being the perpendicular axes to the direction upon which you enter. Even within that, though, there's a little bit of kind of playfulness in that if you kind of break down the geometry of this plan diagram, the distance from here to the back of the apse is actually equal to the distance from here to here. So he's actually creating almost tongue-in-cheek a square plan, even though it's disguised as an oval in terms of at least its his proportionality. And by the way, point of clarification, in the prior lecture, I can't remember the work that we were looking at, but the book mentioned this idea that it wasn't a Baroque, it was a late Renaissance building in Vienna. The book talked about this idea of it following Baroque proportions. I believe I have a better understanding of what it means by Baroque proportions. Baroque proportions basically means it's not following the classical proportions. It's not grounded in Renaissance ideas of proportionality and order. Rather, it's inventing its own proportional system. Borromini's Quattro Fontane, similar idea. The no central plan. When we get to that building, there'll be a more detailed plan. We'll talk about the cloister and the relationship and some of the superimposition. But really, the point is, in the Baroque, we're going away from the traditional church form, the Greek cross. The Latin cross, the basilica plan, these are going away. And I mean, even in the diagrams, it should already look refreshing compared to the work that we've seen so far. Maybe not refreshing, but different. It's clearly different from the work that we've been seeing so far. And really, the oval and the ellipse are the greatest expression of that idea. This one is, let's see. This plan, I didn't identify it. This is San Giacomo, which is by Francesco Capriani da Volterra, and it's 1590. So it's actually really early Baroque, whereas this plan is the Basilica of 14 helpers, the 14 holy helpers, and this is Balthazar Neumann, 1743, 1772. So this is kind of late Baroque. Sorry, not high Baroque, late Baroque. Okay, so that's a bit on the central plan. Okay, really the beginning of this rivalry between Borromini and Bernini. It actually starts by the two of them working side by side. The two of them working side by side and training under Carlo Maderno, who is entrusted at this time of doing the extension. Really, it's considered the nave extension. As we've studied, lots of masters have touched St. Peter's Basilica, which is the seat of the Pope in Rome or Vatican City. The St. Peter's Basilica is most prominently known by this front elevation. This front elevation is an addition to the church that had been being built for about 100 years up until this point. Maderno is entrusted with doing what the Pope would like, which is basically adding on to Michelangelo's original Latin cross plan, and giving the nave a more prominent, wider interior space. I believe there's a plan I'll show you in a moment, but also a functional requirement of allowing the Pope to deliver his message, his sermon, from a balcony on the second floor that actually looks over the entrance to the outside, to the courtyard in front of the Basilica, St. Peter's Basilica. So Carlo Moderno basically builds this extension, which, by the way, he's the subject of lots of criticism when he completes this work, because what it's doing is it's actually, when you're standing here at street view, you no longer have a sense of this magnificent dome in the back. So he's actually criticized for this work initially. But again, this is, kind of the front face of St. Peter's Basilica, and, understand it and recognize it as really the work of Carlo Maderno, which is basically the entry piece of. Oh, here we go. So what you're looking at is an image as though we're standing here looking this way, and this is all Maderno's work, which is an addition onto the original Michelangelo plan. Raphael works on it. Tempietto, I'm blanking on his name right now. This is going back 150 years prior. Anyhow, I'll put it in the notes. Maderno is doing this addition to St. Peter's, this facade addition, or the nave addition to St. Peter's. He dies 1629, and really after his death is when these two, Borromini and Bernini, basically go their separate ways. So after the extension of the nave, which the Pope's kind of two requirements are the ability for the Pope to basically stand out here and deliver a message to the outside, to the courtyard, to the people gathered in front. The second is to give the facade a sort of a palatial feel, to make it feel like a palace, which is basically a punchback to the Counter-Reformation as we've been studying. And I mentioned that in the notes when we were in the lectures, when we were talking about the Counter-Reformation, that actually the Catholic Church is actually going to punch back with a vengeance. And this is actually one of those moments where the church is sort of reasserting itself architecturally and saying, we are very proud of our prominence, of our permanence, of our financial stability, and we want to display that in the most important of our cathedrals. Okay, this is a very interesting building that actually brings together three of the masters, although it is attributed more so to Bernini, and I'm going to present it as though one of Bernini's first of four projects. It actually has it has the fingerprints of Borromini, it has the fingerprints of Pietro da Cortona as well. And we'll get into it. This is Palazzo Barberini, or the Barberini Palace, built from 1625 to 1633. It's in Rome. It's basically the residence of the Barberini Pope. A few interesting things, character-defining architectural elements to point out. 3 stories, clearly. The base has a rusticated feel, rusticated quality to the facade pattern. And the upper, in contrast to the base level, has a more refined quality. That should be sort of obvious right away to you. What I want to draw attention to, in addition to that, with respect to the facade, is the third level. Yes, the bays line up, And yes, generally, geometrically, it looks like the third floor is almost identical to the second floor. It's a repeat of the second floor. But pay close attention to the archway or the arched, the distance between the jamb, the end of the window, and the facade that the window is within. This is Borromini. What Borromini is doing, this is another one of the vocabulary words. I've mentioned this term before, but I've said that we'll get into it with more specificity when we get to this work, which is the Baroque. There's the idea of trompe l'oeil, which is a French term meaning a trick of the eye. This is something both Bernini and Borromini are going to do, and do in very, very clever ways. Bernini at Scala Reggio and Borromini at Palazzo Spada. And we'll look at both of those, both diagrammatically and in terms of image, and you'll see what I mean. It's actually fascinating what they're doing with perspective and proportion to sort of trick our eye. But he's doing it here as well. Borromini is doing it at the third level, which is his work and his detailing. You're seeing basically what he's giving us the effect of is the think back to Alberti and the Roman the deep archway, the Victory Arch that is commonly associated with ancient Rome, and makes its way into some of the civic and ecclesiastical works. You see him making reference to it here. But the reality is this window relative to this facade is the same relationship as this window as to this facade. What he's doing is he's basically taking that distance, that vertical distance, and he's casting so superimposition here is the term you can use. He's superimposing a diagonal line against that flat plane to give the effect as though we're looking at a window that's actually set 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 feet in depth relative to the facade, when in reality it's not. And that's basically achieved by making this a diagonal line instead of making it a straight line back. So he's giving us trompe l'oeil already here. The sort of personality or the character of this master architect is coming through even in this work, where he's basically one part of the project. The third floored windows. Okay, so then we move to so this is Da Cortona's work, which is a ceiling painting. I don't know if there's a better one. So this is basically the main salon, or the primary 2-story room on the inside, the most prominent space within. This is Bernini's architectural work. So the detail work that you're seeing at the opening, the base, the sort of wainscoting, the ceiling or the wall treatment, the cornice at the top, the way the windows are detailed. That's all Bernini's architectural detail work. The ceiling is painting by Da Cortona, which is basically, it's called the Allegory of the Divine Providence of the Barberini. So it's basically a painting to say, it's a ceiling painting to say the Barberini have conquered the world. They are the greatest. And part of that is because they're the ones who have hired them to do this work. So they're basically, doing... they're using art to depict the greatness of their benefactors, because ultimately the benefactors are allowing them to do what they're trained, the art that they're trained to do and that they, I suppose, love to do. But even here, we're seeing trompe l'oeil effect. I'm not an art historian. I'm not an expert in fine art. I'm not going to try to explain, but I do know there's a lot. I think what they talk about is that the architecture, like the wall and the corner treatment, makes its way into the ceiling painting to give a sense of kind of continuity of space. And by doing that, and then also by painting really a sky as the primary background, and then painting basically another ceiling within the mural of the ceiling, it's kind of tricking our eye into almost perceiving this as being glass or transparent, with the sort of corners peeling up, and then the solid opaque center as being three-dimensional mass architectural work, i.e., column roof. When in reality, it's just it's acrylic or it's paint oil applied on the surface of the ceiling. So there's trompe l'oeil here as well, that Da Cortona is using. It's a highly visited space. It's probably one of the primary tourist destinations. Visitors from all over the world come to see the salon, the ceiling, and really, the palace as a whole. But this is probably the thing that remains one of the most memorable experiences in people's mind of the Borromini Palace, is the salon and its ceiling. This amazing kind of rivalry just gives us interesting episode after episode after episode, and the Borromini Palace is no exception. We even saw on the front the sort of differentiation in the window detailing. When you move to the inside, you have that wonderful large two-story salon. And I'm not sure whether it's to the left or to the right, but to one side, you have these stairs, which are the more orthogonal, what they're considered to be the square stairs of Bernini, considered to be masterworks. I mean, the detailing, the proportionality, it's refined, it's well done, it's well built, it's well detailed. But it's completely different from what Borromini has done on the opposite side. So he has this sort of concentric, elliptical central volume to contrast with his rival's sort of geometric orthogonal square volume, that the square central space and the stairs wrap around, where here you have the oval or the elliptical central space with the stairs wrapping around. Both masterfully done, both wonderful detailing, but completely sort of opposite ways of solving the problem. Okay, this is the Quirinale Palace, or the Quirinale Church. I'm sorry, Bernini. So we're going to look at two more projects of Bernini's. Sant'Andrea al Quirinale. He completes this in 1661. This is clearly has some basis in the classical, but there's at least two what should be immediately obvious, unique things happening at I would say three things that should jump out right away that help you identify this as Baroque, as new, as different relative to the work that we've seen so far. I would say the first is what I would refer to as an edicule, or what the book refers to as an edicule, which is basically kind of an entrance piece, a curved entrance. An edicule doesn't have to be curved. This is a curved edicule. Actually, that's one of the vocabulary terms. A small shrine or a niche covered by a pediment. So the pediment in this case is really this element that's in relief on the building. And so there's this curved semicircular edicule that's projecting out, that's basically defining the entrance into the museum. That's a unique thing. It's not something that we've seen yet in other work. Actually, four things. The second, I would say, is the circular tiered entrance. This is also different from what we've seen so far, where either we have a grand central stair, depending if we're looking at an Alberti work. He experimented a little bit with offsetting the entrance to the left and to the right, and basically setting a solid solid mass in the center point. Bernini is doing something I think refreshingly new and basically putting a circular um, series of steps to get us up to the primary level, the entry level. Third is you can see the mass of the building behind. It's clearly not an orthogonal Greek cross plan, Latin cross plan, nor is it a basilica. It is an oval volume, which is not something we've seen so far in any prior precedent architecturally. The fourth thing that I didn't realize immediately, but I kind of read as I was looking more carefully at the image, is you can see that he's turned the base of the columns 45 degrees such that the edge is actually pointing towards us rather than the edge being pointed perpendicular to our viewing plane. So he's kind of he's saying there's something different happening here, or I'm doing either they're sort of coding and signing to you that they're doing something new. That's a very common Baroque characteristic. So that's kind of an oblique view. So you can see here, I think I mentioned the terms convex and concave. Convex and concave are referring to basically an arch, and so it's either the space, that depending on how you're reading the curve, it's basically an inward curve and an outward curve. The way I think of the sort of mnemonic that I use is concave has a V, and a V is pointing to me inward. There's a single point pointing inward. So an inward pointing curve would be concave. Convex, the letter X, has 2 points that in my mind point outward. So convex is a curve pointing outward. So it's really a matter of where you're standing in relation. If we were to say we're standing at the center, looking towards the church entrance at Quirinale, the walls off to the side would be creating, I would say, a concave that are curving inward towards us. Here is a plan. So again, one of the two masters, Bernini, is showing us how he's doing the non-central plan church. I think we looked at a simpler version of this earlier, but he's basically flipping the idea on its head of approaching a space along its long axes. And actually, you're approaching along a short axis and you're crossing the long axes. Paired columns, not something new. We've seen paired columns before. What's unique is that we're seeing paired columns on an ellipse or on a circular plane really for the first time. We've seen apses. It's not a new thing. It's new in terms of the way he's arranging it in plan, or he's using it formally in a new way, but it's still from the same kit of parts. And the altar towards the back. There's a better view of the steps. So if we were standing here, this would be concave. If you were reading the plan, I suppose, from the inside and you were referring to this, you could say it's convex. It's pointing outward relative to where we're standing. There's a view of the dome at Sant'Andrea al Quirinale. I know this building as Quirinale. I always forget the saint that it's associated with, Sant'Andrea Quirinale. The book talks about let me go back to this slide. The book talks about the notion of tension. And I think what it means by tension is when you're looking at a plan like this, you're seeing basically a competition or a tension that's created between this central point and this central point. The two are sort of competing with one another because this central point is drawing from this axes and this axes, whereas this is drawing from this axes, this axes. Obviously, these other two side chapels are responding to those respective points. And so there's this kind of like game, this tension, this competition in our own mind's eye when we're looking at this as a diagram of those kind of two central points upon one another. I guess you could argue there's even a tension between central points, plural, multiple central points, because we know that there's at least two here in reading this plan. And then there's an axis here that I would say it creates a third dimension in this direction. So point, point, line, neither of which are coincident. We can look back at hundreds of prior plans from buildings that we've looked at so far, where all three of those points are actually coincident upon the same plane. Here, there's a decentralizing of those central points and focus, and that's one of the characteristic elements that the book talks about when it talks about a tension that's created. The lining of the coffers in the dome detailing with the pilasters, I think, helps accentuate the circular form of the inside of the dome. The way light is used in the Baroque is, I think, just magnificent. You can kind of see a little bit of that quality here, a little bit of that quality here. If you bear with me just a few more minutes, you'll see with Borromini's work the way he uses light in just a masterful way, again, to kind of help contribute to that notion of theater. Okay, Bernini's magnum opus, his largest work, but also his probably most experienced work. This is an image that you've probably seen before. You know, when we see pictures of Rome, we see the piazza in front of St. Peter's. And what Bernini, so Bernini is responsible for this work, but we're going to look also more specifically at the steps that get you from the plaza, from the piazza to the papal residence, for lack of a better term. And this is the project known as Scala Regia. Bernini completes the work in 1666. And it's effectively these stairs that allow you to go from the Piazza of St. Peter's to the Vatican Palace. It's considered the royal stair. In fact, Scala Regia means royal stair. So here's St. Peter's. You've seen the building. You're very familiar with this plan. This is the Moderno edition, and Bernini does the sort of arms, kind of reaching out from St. Peter's, enclosing the space of the piazza, creating this sort of memorable, magnificent, what looks actually probably to many like a classical Renaissance space. So he's doing that work, but he's also doing the Scala Reggio, really a fine example of Baroque work. And this is, I think, his greatest example of trompe l'oeil. So the way these stairs work is you come in off of the piazza, you get to this landing, and you immediately to your left, you get to this intermediate landing, and then there's this access way that gets you to the piano nobile of the papal palace, or allows you to continue going up and enter from the third level, which would be beyond this landing. Couple things that you're seeing. First of all, the walls are tapering. They're basically closing your perspective. They're narrowing as you move upward. What that's doing is it's basically closing the space upon you. You're moving from this grand urban space where thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are gathered. So you're moving kind of from that to this intermediate landing, and you're about to enter a very narrow space before you get into the palace. Well, Bernini believes that should happen with a transition. So he's actually making that transition gradual. He's kind of closing space on us in a gradual manner. Another one of the vocabulary terms is intercolumniation, which is basically the spacing between columns. So there's an alteration of intercolumniation. There isn't a regular intercolumniation, meaning he doesn't use one dimension that separates these two columns 1 and 2, then columns 2 and 3, then columns 3 and 4. Rather, he's kind of playing with a very small, maybe 8 times larger, 8 times larger, 8 times larger, 8 times larger, maybe 4 times larger, down to that same proportion. So it's maybe one. Let's just call this x. So it's x, 8x, 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 maybe 6x down to x. So he's kind of changing the rhythm of the columns. What that does when you look at this space three-dimensionally, and I think, so there's an image of the space three-dimensionally. When you play with the intercolumnation, what that tends to do is actually brings the lines of perspective, or the vanishing points. It sort of compresses them. It makes the space feel deeper than it actually is. It elongates, I should say, the vantage point, or the vanishing point in the background. Those of you that have taken architectural drawing courses and have done kind of 1 point, 2 point perspective understand that idea of kind of stretching that vanishing point to appear as though it's farther away. And actually, you can read the intercolumniation probably best from this section view, which is showing you from landing, up, intermediate landing, up. You can go into the palace there, or continue moving up to this landing and get into the palace there. But here you can see that gap, the gap, the gap, the gap, and then the sort of climb of the niche openings are also contributing to that trompe l'oeil effect. Scala Reggio is right there. I mean, this is a lecture onto itself, just looking at the detailing and the amazing, amazing work of Bernini. I've always appreciated just even this gesture of the sort of arms that, to me, are like embracing this piazza, or the open space. I've always, I don't know, I've always read this as a very warm, geometric, architectural gesture. You can see it there kind of three-dimensionally. And it frames in. It also kind of, encloses that space and makes something really, really large actually, feel a little bit more intimate and private. There's a good view of St. Peter's, and you can see the various additions and the work that's been done. So Moderno's work is effectively adding this portion to the existing church. Okay, shifting to Borromini. Gosh, I'm already at 57. Okay, I'll try to not go much longer than another 15 minutes. This is, like I said, this is for me Borromini and Bernini are two of the most important architects, I think, in the history of architecture, and it's important really to understand the Baroque through their work. And spend a little bit more time, as I mentioned in the midterm prep lecture, or the midterm planning, mid-semester planning lecture that I posted this weekend. I do want you to start to do a little bit more in-depth reading. As I've mentioned, your exams are going to go to 4 sentences now from 3. So I'm spending a little bit more time and doing a little bit more of a closer or a deeper read of Borromini's and Bernini's work, really as a way to encourage you to take a little bit more time to start to unpack what you're looking at architecturally, and sort of give that back to me in your writing. Okay, so this is Borromini's Oratorio de San Filippini, St. Philip. Really, it's an adjacent space to a church that's used primarily for preaching and music. What the main reason I use this is, number one, it's early Borromini, but the character of the of the master that we're going to see is already evident. This is really the first time, and in the Baroque, nobody has done this before. We're starting to actually curve facades. We're starting to peel facades back off of the orthogonal plane that they ordinarily have been sitting on for the 1600 years up until this point. That in and of itself sort of activates the facade. And that's why people use the term drama when they talk about the Baroque, because there's this sort of animated quality. The curve tends to give architecture, form, space, an animated, almost a dynamic movement like quality. And we're starting to see that experimentation or that character manifest itself as early as 1629 to 1635 is when oratorio is built. But even the sort of playfulness of the pediment. Yes, it's a pediment. Yes, we've seen pediments before, but he's kind of like taking the pediments and then extending the wings of that pediment, almost giving it sort of bird, kind of spread eagle type of a quality over the entire bay of where the window is, rather than just above the window. He's doing something almost entirely different at the upper level, at the third level, and even with this pediment here. Yes, column. Yes, column. Yes, those columns are actually supporting, which is different from some of the columns that we're going to see at San Carlo al Quattro Fontane. The edicule is like Bernini's. It's something new that we haven't seen before. The use of kind of this architectural gesture. And then that kind of carries up to the second level. And then, interestingly enough, as you get to the third level, I read actually that same arch, but actually flipped 90 degrees on the vertical plane, kind of repeated in a unique way. I would describe it as basically semicircle, semicircle differentiated, rotated. There's that kind of playfulness already coming to the fore with Borromini. And then the addition here of the clock tower above. He gets fired from this commission, so he actually doesn't complete this commission. Although some of this detail, the curvature of the facade, is one of his early contributions that sticks. He actually doesn't complete a lot of the detailing of this because, like I said, he either quits from the job or is fired from the job. But this element is, I mean, you can just look at the work. I mean, then the sort of look at me quality that the bell tower is expressing almost looks out of place. In fact, it looks out of place relative to the rest of the work. So Borromini's contribution. Borromini's masterwork is considered to be this building, which is San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane. Here is the slightly more detailed plan I was referring to earlier. And he does this work, this is a church, and he does this work for the Trinitarians, the Spanish Trinitarians, who believe, as the name implies, the Trinity is one of the most important elements of their doctrine. And so what Borromini does is he over and over again in this work repeats the symbolism or the metaphor of the Trinity and allows it to inform his work. What do I mean by that? You look at this plan and it looks kind of organic, maybe an ellipse superimposed within a larger ellipse, and then those two ellipses are kind of rationalized against one another with a convex curve spanning between those points. Well, really what Borromini is doing here is he's superimposing an ellipse over an 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He's superimposing an ellipse over an octagon, really all within a rectangle. So he's superimposing three shapes onto one another to create this form. He does the same thing in the cloister. The cloister, if I haven't given you, cloister is going to be one of your vocabulary terms for the Baroque. And the cloister is basically an open, an semi-enclosed space. This is the cloister. This wrapping element is a cloister. It's basically a space that's under roof or under cover, which has a solid wall on one side, but has an open quadrangle or a quad on the opposite side, oftentimes enclosed by columns or by a colonnade. So this is really a cloister. It's common for like monks or people in buildings of all types, not even necessarily just religious buildings. In fact, one of the best examples of a cloister is at Fresno City College. If you go to the old administration building, there's a cloister that basically wraps around a very beautiful open quadrangle or a quad space. That's a cloister. Even in the cloister, you see this superimposition of, you can kind of see the octagon, the convex inward or concave if you're standing here. Corners give the expression of an angle, which allows you to read this as, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 as an octagon. Superimposed within, again, you can read the ellipse here, or you can read it as a rectangle. So the notion of Trinity is repeated here. Repeated again in the dome. One of my favorite Borromini elements is this dome and the way he uses the light coming through the oculus here. You can see the triangle and the notion of the Trinity here. You can also see in the coffering three different shapes being used: the cross, the octagon, and the, if you want to call this a parallelogram or a diamond shape or a ruby shape. He's using three shapes to create this sort of sequence of coffers. He's also incidentally modulating the size of those going up, which is another trompe-l'oeil effect or a trick of the eye effect that Borromini is using here. And just the way he brings light into this space, I think, is just absolutely masterful and delightful. One of my favorites, my favorite trompe-l'oeil is Borromini's trompe-l'oeil that he uses here at Galleria Spada, which is a private residence of the Pope. And he is setting a sculpture at the end of a long colonnade. It's basically off of a courtyard. It's a place to curate art, sculpture. And he's set what looks to be a fairly large sculpture at the end of this column or this hallway, except for the fact that sculpture at the end of a hallway is actually only about 2.5 feet tall. And I apologize if this is a little bit grainy, but I think I can explain everything I need to explain about the trompe-l'oeil effect that Borromini is using at Galleria Spada, where he's setting this sculpture that's actually like half the size of a human figure. Does not look that way from this image, but clearly when you look at the section drawing, reveals to you that he set this really small sculpture on top of a base, and the way he's tricked us into making it seem as though that's a large sculpture at the end of this corridor is by collapsing our vantage point, are basically tapering the walls inward and the columns inward, like Bernini is doing at Scala Regia, but in a different way. Different in that it's his work, not Bernini's work. So Borromini is doing the same kind of effect. He is also playing with the intercolumniation, the spacing between the columns. He's also bringing the ceiling plane down on us, which is also contributing to the fact that it looks as though this hallway, this corridor, is deeper than it actually is, which is what allows our eyes to be fooled into thinking that that's a large sculpture at the end of a large corridor. And then also the fresco that's painted upon this, you can see that kind of line of the vanishing point is accentuated further by the basically the painting that's applied to the wall beyond, is kind of framing this thing to look as though it's a continuation, when in fact it's just painting on a wall. So even that in and of itself is trompe l'oeil. You can see the way the ceiling closes on us best in this section diagram. So you can see the columns themselves on us, the walls tilted inward, is tapered in plan. The ceiling is, walls are closed on us in the Z, what allows us to give it that trompe l'oeil effect. There's a slightly more detailed plan. San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane. Slide was a little bit out of place. I apologize. Oh, the other thing about Quattro Fontane is that not only is there this sort of over-the-top curvature with the facade treatment. I mean, I almost don't need to say anything about this slide. Just look at the slide, study it, and you should know clearly that this is Baroque in comparison to anything else that we've looked at, if for nothing else, for the high use of curvature in the facade. But when I talked about kind of losing sight of that notion of structural bearing, this is what we mean, is that columns are really used as decoration, not to actually hold up the building any longer in the Baroque. And then and then the peeling off the sort of expression of the columns off of the facade was one of the early elements the book mentioned about the Baroque that you can see here. In fact, the term was the thrust of the column. So that idea, I think, gets articulated here probably best. Okay, and the final work that we're going to look at of Borromini is Sant'Ivo alla Sapienza, the Sapienza church as it's known. He builds this in 1650. Sapienza in Latin means wisdom. And it's a church dedicated to, or that is based on the memory of Solomon. And through Solomon, an understanding of David, and through those two, this notion of wisdom and knowledge. So what Borromini does is Borromini uses he uses the Star of David. Well, we know it today as the Star of David. At the time, it would have been known as the Star of Solomon, to kind of play forward this idea of wisdom, and uses that as basically a plan generator to design the church. And you can see the two triangles superimposed onto themselves here. Again, the idea of tension, decentralization is common. The other thing that Borromini does here in I think, a refreshing manner is he kind of juxtaposes the concave, if we're standing here, the concave or the inward bending curve. He sets that against the orthogonal geometry of the courtyard, which I think creates an even stronger contrast between the courtyard and the building facade itself. Thereby, I think, accentuating the uniqueness of his architecture. You can see the sort of plan geometry generation here. Sapienza, I mentioned, means wisdom. Goodness. depth, volume, trompe l'oeil, clearly, the playfulness of the cupola here at the top is characteristically Baroque, unmistakably Baroque. But the view of that from here's a good sense of that juxtaposition of the convex against the orthogonal courtyard geometry, defining this sort of grand entrance, but not to be outdone, the interior quality. That's another, I would say, a highly characteristic thing of the Baroque, is that the interior quality seems to, as much as the exterior has this look at me kind of quality to it, almost like a hyper hyper use of detail and ornament and drama and flair. In my opinion, and in the opinion of lots of architectural scholars and historians, that quality outdoes itself when you get to the interior of many of the Baroque works of architecture, and this is no exception to the rule. Santiago alla Sapienza, Francesco Borromini. Okay, that's it. I went a little bit more than I like to go, but like I mentioned, this is an important time period. My favorite time period in architectural history, not counting the sort of contemporary work that we'll look at the end of the course. So I think worth the extra 15 or 20 minutes that we spent. So this is Borromini, Bernini, Moderno, Fontana, and we will look more, well, not just them, I should also add, Carlo Moderno, Borromini, Bernini, Pietro da Cortona, Carlo Fontana, Carlo Rinaldi are the sort of early, the Baroque masters, for lack of a better term, with Bernini and Borromini kind of setting themselves apart with the work that we've just looked at for the past 30 or 40 minutes. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to the next lecture on the late Baroque, and I should post that within the next couple of days before the end of week 9. Thank you.